Why is it that all modern hatchbacks seem to look the same? Is it really impossible to make a 5-door car that stands out from the crowd?
MINI clearly thinks that you can, and as proof, it's produced the Countryman as an antidote to the monotony of mainstream modern motoring. Yes, it may look like a Mini that has eaten all the pies, but you'd never mistake it for any other brand, despite the more useful, larger body.
However, this isn't the only car with head-turning looks, which also claims to provide enough practicality for a growing family.
The Alfa Giulietta is one of the most beautiful cars ever made. Every crease, every curve and every contour have been lovingly crafted to create a shape that can make other motorists green with envy. But despite the supermodel looks, Giulietta is as attainable as the girl next door. Then there's the DS4. Citroen effectively ripped up the design rulebook to create this latest addition to its growing premium brand. Blurring the lines between conventional car segments more than any other crossover to date, the DS4 proves the French are back to their daring best. Finally, we come to the Nissan Juke. Charged with emulating the success of the Qashqai, but in a more compact and streetwise silhouette, it answers the age-old question, what do you get if you cross a Super Mini with a moon buggy and an evil frog? Anyway, all four of these cars are an alternative to the normal humdrum hatchback. But which one does it with the fewest compromises? To find out, we'll see how they measure up in terms of practicality, costs, and driving dynamics, which seems like a pretty good place to begin.
Minis are supposed to be fun to drive, and the Countryman is no exception. Obviously, being slightly larger than the normal 3-door hatchback, it isn't quite so go-kart-like or as darty, but it still has that kind of Mini trait of being responsive and agile through the corners. And of course, because you've got that jacked up suspension and the higher ride height, you get a better view over traffic, which means it's actually easier to drive in town.
It also means the Countryman can deal with more than just tarmac, especially if you go for the all-wheel drive version. Just don't expect it to do much more extreme off-roading than this.
But while it may be more capable than your normal Mini, the Countryman still has some of the same problems. For instance, the ride is pretty harsh and it kind of jiggles about a bit over rough surfaces. Also, at higher speeds, you get quite a bit of noise entering the cabin, and as a result, for longer journeys, it's not quite as comfortable as your more traditional family hatchbacks.
And that brings us on to the sexy Italian. It may be the most conventional car of our distinctive quartet, but don't go thinking that makes it boring.
Alfa makes some great engines, and no matter whether you go for a diesel or a petrol Giulietta, they all provide a great blend of performance and economy. For instance, in this car I've got a 1.4 litre turbo with 168 brake horsepower, and it will do 0 to 60 in 7.8 seconds, yet return almost 50 miles per gallon.
This particular engine is so good, it's actually won an award. However, performance fans should look out for the 1.7 litre Cloverleaf model, as it has 232 brake horsepower and can do 150 miles an hour.
As you'd expect, on a twisty road, the Giulietta handles well. It's pretty comfy too, although be warned of the Veloce model because it has sport suspension, which is a bit stiffer. The only problem I have is that the whole experience is spoiled somewhat by something called the DNA system, which allows you to alter the car's throttle response and steering weight using this rather naff looking switch down here. It allows you to choose between 3 different modes: dynamic, normal and all-weather. The only trouble is there's no kind of happy medium between them. For instance, in dynamic mode, the steering feels overly heavy and artificial, but if you go into normal mode, then the throttle response is curtailed. And let's face it, you don't buy a turbocharged Alfa Romeo to kind of limit its performance.
Despite this, the Alfa's quieter cabin and more comfortable ride means it's still a better drive than the bouncy and noisy Mini. But what about the Citroen?
The first thing you notice when driving the DS4 is just how quiet its engines are, even the diesels. The second thing you spot is the raised ride height. I mean, it's not quite as lofty as that as in an SUV, but you do feel ever so slightly more superior than other road users. However, the most surprising thing with this car is just, well, how sporty it feels. It handles way, way better than the soggy C4 on which it's based. The steering's sharp, there's lots of grip, and there's hardly any body roll round corners, thanks to sportier suspension.
There's a trade-off though in terms of comfort, because the ride gets a bit bumpy over rough surfaces, and that makes your fatty bits wobble about, which isn't particularly pleasant.
As for the downsides, well, rear visibility isn't great because the screen's quite small, and you get a massive back pillar which creates a bit of a blind spot when you're looking over your shoulder to pull out at junctions.
Does the Nissan Juke fare any better? It's pretty good for nipping about round town, doesn't have an annoying blind spot like the Citroen, while the jacked up suspension means it copes with speed humps far better than the Alfa.
Sadly though, when you get out onto the open road, the Juke isn't as much fun as you think it would be. I mean, it lacks the poise of a normal Super Mini. It's certainly not as engaging to drive as, say, a Ford Fiesta. And while it is comfortable, the suspension seems to fidget about over small imperfections in the road, and then when you're going at high speed on the motorway, some of the engines seem a bit noisy. For instance, the turbo in this car kind of makes an annoying whine, a bit like a food processor.
So then, to the scoreboard, because it's time to allocate marks for driving. The Juke unfortunately comes last with 1 point, the Mini gets 2, the Alfa scores 3 as it's narrowly beaten by the Citroen, which gets 4. That's 1 category down and 2 to go, costs and practicality, and we'll look at those in the second part of our video.